Thank you. It's a pleasure to see so many people out there who embrace awareness and are willing to act as a sponge and soak up all this great information. I am here to talk a little bit about the potential concerns and strategies that viticulturists here in the Rogue Valley and throughout Southern Oregon might consider, both problems and potential solutions. And I've been involved in the Oregon wine industry since the mid-'80s, and in Southern Oregon specifically since the early '90s. So I have a little bit of perspective. What I'm going to do first is just cover a couple concerns that have already been brought up that apply to the wine grape industry. The first of which is reduced water availability, and by that you've already seen the graphs. We have rainfall, and that's remaining fairly constant, but what's happening is with the decrease in snowpack, the water that is used for agricultural irrigation throughout the season is becoming limited, and it's going to cause some impacts further down the road. There was a lot of concern this year early in the season that the vineyardists might be out of luck if the irrigation districts shut off their water. It just so happened that because the season was so early, most of the growers did get their crop off and still had water available to give those vines a little bit of a drink post-harvest, which sets them up for success the following year. Another concern is changing climate. Increased heat units might cause a little bit of a difference in what insects or disease pressures we see in the vineyards. An example of this is the grape mealybug, which is a insect that typically in this climate only has one generation per year. With increased heat units, that insect could potentially have 2 generations per year. Grape mealybugs are a known vector for leaf roll virus, which is one of the viral diseases that attack grapevines. So that could become a concern. Additionally, many of the diseases that grapes suffer from, the viral and bacterial diseases specifically, are more pronounced when it's hot, when the vine is under water stress or other types of stress induced by the heat. They manifest themselves more dramatically and have more of an influence on the crop that's being produced. Another potential problem is a reduced in actual vine metabolism. Grapevines tend to close their stomates, the holes in the leaves through which they exchange gas, and stop photosynthetic activity, or at least curtail it, as temperatures in the leaf area get in excess of 90 degrees. So if indeed we have average daily temperatures that are rising, the grapes will respond by producing a little bit less photosynthetic materials, less carbon sequestration in the hotter parts of the day, and that can lead to less vine health over time because they're not putting in as much material down into their roots to survive in subsequent seasons. It can also affect the current season's crop negatively by not allowing the grape to totally ripen that fruit. Another concern are related to the actual compositional changes that occur in a grape berry as it ripens. And in warmer seasons, you are always going to typically see increased sugar levels in the grapes. There's typically more photosynthetic activity unless we get to that upper limit that curtails it. And so grapes tend to develop sugar, and oftentimes they do that in a warm climate. The sugar levels rise in the grape and get to what are considered harvest levels oftentimes earlier than the grape is physiologically mature and ripe in terms of winemaking potential. An example of that is manifested in the fact that the higher sugar level grapes are going to result in higher alcohols in the wines, which can cause an imbalance in the flavor, the texture of the wines. They're perceived as hot, alcoholic, which good or bad. And it can also cause high levels of alcohol in the fermenting juice can actually cause yeast mortality if you don't select the appropriate yeast strain. Another effect of high temperatures during the maturation of the grape are a potential reduced acid level in the grape juice, and which relates to an increase in the pH of the juice and the wine that results. One thing that's made Oregon wine so great and has allowed us to capture the international attention is the fact that Oregon wines do retain their crisp acidity, their freshness, their vivacious lusciousness. And if we have reduced acid levels, higher pH, we are not only going to shift towards the flabby Californian-style wines, but we can also potentially encounter some microbial problems that occur at higher pH levels in the wine. So higher pH, unbalanced, and potential microbes. The other thing that can occur in hot seasons is there's a lot of aroma compounds and aroma precursors that are in the grape and are varying throughout the ripening process. In an exceptionally warm year, a lot of those can be volatilized. And so it changes the aroma profile in the finished product if you have excessive heat. That's part of the reason one needs to choose the correct region to grow specific varieties, especially varieties that are noted for their aromatic profile, like Riesling, Gewürztraminer, some others. So it can change the aroma characteristics of the wine. But we do have some strategies that can help us through this. We don't need to give up and tear out those vineyards and put in subdivisions. We can make it work. Part of it involves smarter farming. There's strategies that work for existing vineyards, and there's also, I'll cover a little bit later, some strategies that we can look at for potential vineyards of the future that are not yet planted. But for existing vineyards, let's farm smarter. Let's practice what is called precision agriculture, which implies more use of technology to determine what's going on. A lot of progressive growers are putting in weather stations on their property. They're putting in soil moisture sensing devices in the soil. There's various types of those that are available. And they're also monitoring the vine water status to tell when their vines need irrigation, and if so, how much. And that can lead to a practice called deficit irrigation. Deficit irrigation is a technique where you give the vine just enough water to survive. And early in the season, you actually cause the vine to struggle somewhat. That produces a more balanced canopy. It doesn't throw all of its energy into producing leaves and shoots that are long and shade the canopy. You get a more physiologically balanced canopy, and it can increase the grape quality as a result. It also reduces, by practicing deficit irrigation, you are using less water during the irrigation cycle. So that's very consistent with what we need to accomplish in light of changing water supplies. Can't see what I wrote there. So it also, as I said, results, if you don't have a shaded canopy, you end up with much better quality grapes as a result. There's some components that are present in heavily shaded grapes that are considered a negative aroma impact in wines, and those are reduced by having a more open canopy that allows sunlight and heat a little bit into the canopy. Another strategy we can practice are what are called crop load adjustments. Basically, it's a technique where you're trying to put a little bit more fruit on the same surface area of grape leaves. or vine canopy, leaf area. And what that can do is it can put a vine more into balance if that vine is getting too much heat and too much maturation. For instance, if you're growing Pinot Noir in the Rogue Valley, Pinot Noir is a varietal that's traditionally associated with slightly cooler conditions. Sometimes Pinot grapes can get really ripe, overripe in fact. And if you practice some crop load adjustments and put a slightly heavier crop load on it, it'll slow down the maturation somewhat and end up with more balanced grapes. Another strategy that Ron just referred to is the removal of cover crops. A lot of vineyards have a grass or weed, whatever the case may be, alleyway between the grapevines. And if that is reduced earlier in the season, as Ron alluded to, you're going to conserve soil moisture and do a better job as a steward of that moisture and using it for the plants rather than putting it up into the atmosphere. Some things to consider for future plantings is that cool season varietals, especially if grown here in Southern Oregon, you need to choose the site very carefully. They should either be planted at higher elevations than they're currently being planted, or in cooler regions of the valley, including little cool microclimates that may exist on your properties or on in specific valleys of the Rogue Basin. Another thing to consider would be looking at areas that typically weren't considered ultimate locations for grapes. Say, for example, you've got a east sloping hillside that gets a little bit of shade late in the afternoon. Maybe that's something to consider for a cool season varietal. It'll still get the sunlight it needs early in the day. It'll get the heat units it needs to ripen the crop, but it'll get that protection of late afternoon shade to provide a little bit of cooling, slow down maturation as harvest approaches, and give you a more balanced grape as a result. And another thing is to move more towards warm season varietals. They're basically Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris are varieties that Oregon is well known for. They're not always the best choice for the Rogue Valley. There are some very nice Spanish and Bordeaux varietals that are more accustomed and do better in higher heat unit, degree day growing areas. And I think a wise grower would look at planting those varietals instead of the cooler season varietals. And just to give you some hope, the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center is there, and we're doing research to provide information and get it out to the growers and to the public so that we can adapt to the changing conditions and survive into the future. An example of that, we are doing studies on crop load in Pinot Noir. We're currently doing additional studies on deficit irrigation. That picture that I'm sure you cannot see is a whole vine growth chamber that I designed. It encloses an entire grapevine in a clear mylar bag, brings in air from above, about 14 feet above the canopy, and inside that we can measure photosynthesis going on, we can measure carbon sequestration, we can calculate water use efficiency. So it's just giving us some answers of what works. This particular one is in use in a deficit irrigation trial we're doing in some Tempranillo grapes up in the Umpqua. But there's a lot more things to look at in the future, including canopy architecture considerations. Typically, like in the Willamette Valley, most of the vines are grown in a very narrow vertical canopy, vertical curtain. I think for Southern Oregon, and given the heat we have, maybe a more open canopy architecture should be considered. Provides a little bit more shading, provides a little bit better conditions in a hot climate. So don't give up hope. Grapevines are here to stay. I think everyone, for the most part, agrees they enhance our quality of life in Southern Oregon. I've only met one person who thought it was building a Disneyland for winos, but most people appreciate grapevines. Thank you very much.